in today's reading from Proverbs. Does not wisdom call out? Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice at the highest point along the way where the paths meet? She takes her stand beside the gate leading into the city. At the entrance, she cries aloud, "To you, people, I call out. I raise my voice to all mankind. You who are simple, gain prudence. You who are foolish, set your hearts on it." And so forth. My mouth speaks what is true. My lips detest wickedness. It reminds me of this, the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. She stands and invites all of mankind. But she is a figure in Proverbs who comes right after the prostitute. Remember, the prostitute, the adulteress, leads the poor victim into adultery, leads him astray. She's the opposite of that. She is calling all men to wisdom, to prudence, to understanding, to life, and away from wickedness, whereas the adulteress wickedly calls for secret sins. Now, there are other things that I wanted to talk about today. In Genesis, we begin to see the call of Moses. But I found this part interesting. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. The reawakening of the story of salvation after 450 years. By the way, back when God speaks to Abraham, when he's still called Abram, God tells him and prophesies that his descendants will suffer for 450 years in slavery in a land where they are sojourners, where they are not in their own home. And he will call them out. He will draw them out through the water. By the way, he doesn't prophesy this, but that's what happens with the parting of the Red Sea. That's like baptism, drawing out through the water from death to life, from slavery to freedom. And Moses, the name, as we are told, if you look at the footnote from a few chapters ago, when Moses is drawn out of the water, he is drawn out of the water where he would have died as a baby. The name Moses means to draw out, and he will help God draw his people out from slavery, out from Egypt, out from darkness and death. But notice here, it's the people's suffering and their cry to God, the cri de cor, the cry from their hearts, the cry from their suffering and misery that reawakens. It says God remembers them. Well, God doesn't forget anything. But I think that's the writer's way of saying that the relationship between God and his people is reawakened in their suffering and in their call to be freed, to be liberated. I'm going to look at St. Paul. I'm going to show you what I did today was I took pictures of this because I've got the New Jerusalem Bible. And the thing is, I don't know if you can get this online, but it's really a cool translation. And I'm trying to see, okay, I have to look at this because I want to see, these are the footnotes. And I know there was one of the footnotes really interested me. I love these footnotes. Footnote E in chapter 5. There's E. You see that tiny little E? Okay. Paul writes to the Corinthians, and remember, he's written a first letter to them already. If we have been unreasonable, it was for God. If reasonable, for you, for the love of Christ overwhelms us when we consider that if one man died for all, then all have died. His purpose in dying for all humanity was that those who should live not anymore for themselves, but for him who died and was raised to life for them. Now, there's 2 footnotes there. I mean, if you just read that, as many of you are telling me, students, it's confusing. I mean, he's saying, if we have been unreasonable, it was for God. If reasonable for you, what does that mean? And then for the love of Christ overwhelms us. Well, he's explaining why he has been reasonable or unreasonable. He's carried away by the love of Christ. That much you can kind of figure out yourself. For the love of Christ overwhelms us when we consider that if one man died for all, meaning Jesus, then all have died. What? His purpose in dying for all humanity was that those who live should live not anymore for themselves, but for him who died and was raised to life for them. That is his way of drawing people through the waters of baptism out of death and slavery to life. But what do the footnotes say? Okay, you gotta follow it for these tiny little, and it's written in this tiny little font, but you can make it huge because of the power of the internet. Man, look at that. Footnote E. This is where he says, if I have been unreasonable, it was for your own good. If reasonable, for the sake of Christ. An allusion to earlier events. Paul was no doubt unreasonable in his letter written with many tears, which he refers to in 2 Corinthians 2:4. But this was for God, to show the uncompromising demands of God. If he is reasonable, it is for you, Corinthians, to make an impression on his reader in his desire to win people over. In both cases, he is compelled by the love of Christ. See also 5:14, or that's what they're talking from. That helps. These footnotes sometimes help. By the way, footnotes can also hurt. There's all kinds of terrible footnotes in, for instance, the New American Bible. You've got to be a little discerning. But this clearly makes sense. Remember, Paul is like an emotional father, a Jewish father, scolding his children, and then they get mad at him and his heart is broken. And he's trying to explain to them that when he slaps them around in his letters and in his supervision of them, which is what a bishop is, an episkopos, an overseer, that's what bishops are supposed to do, and they no longer do this. He's supposed to be overseeing his flock and correcting them, even if it makes them mad. And he's now saying, I'm sorry that I did this, but if I did it, it was because of the love of Christ. The next footnote, Christ dies for all, footnote F, that is, in the name of all, as head representing the whole of humanity. Christ, the new Adam, is mankind itself dying on the cross. But the value of this death comes from the loving obedience which it shows, the sacrifice of the total gift of life. And then you can also refer to Romans 5:19, Philippians 2:8, Luke 22:42, John 15:13, Hebrews 9-10, 9-10. Believers participate in this death through baptism. Romans 6:3-6, and must ratify this offering of Christ by their own lives. 2 Corinthians 5:15 and Romans 6:8-11. You know what I ought to do, students? Is I ought to make you look up all of those references. But what I'm going to do is we'll look them up in class the next time class meets. This video is for Valentine's Day. And so on Monday when we meet after the weekend, we will look at these references and, of course, at some of your comments. That's the kind of stuff that can really help. But there are some footnotes that more or less tell you things like, the Gospel of John wasn't written by John. Well, we know that Jesus really didn't say this. Of course, we don't know what Jesus did or didn't really say, but we're just going to say that Jesus didn't really say this. And so let's just explain away this whole passage. Probably half the footnotes in the New American Bible are like that. So you got to be careful. But then there are footnotes written by people you can tell are real scripture scholars who care and who have devoted their lives to this because, as Paul says, and I've got to look it up to get it right, for the love of Christ overwhelms us. For the love of Christ overwhelms us. And that's what makes people seriously study the Bible. Because wisdom calls And she's not just an adulteress or a woman of ill repute on the street. She represents the way to God, a way that the Jews will have to take in their difficult escape from slavery in Egypt.